Mics are working. It's an off chance. Hello, they work. Okay. This one, when you turn it on, it will sync up and it'll turn green. Just I'm using green. And then that one.
Thank you, Ray.
We're starting. Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome our guest tonight. Thanks so much for being here, Sara Lippmann. I'll read her bio first, and then she'll read from her new novel, Lech. So Sara Lippmann is the author of the story collection Doll Palace, re-released by 713 Books and Jerks from Mason Jar Press. Her work has been honored by the New York Foundation of the Arts and has appeared in the Millions, The Lit Hub, Best Small Fiction, Split Lip, Joyland, Wig Leaf, and elsewhere. She received a BA from Brown and MFA from the New School and has been teaching creative writing for over 20 years. Currently, she teaches with Jericho Writers. For many years, she co-hosted the Sunday Salon, a long-standing NYC reading series founded by Nita Noveno. Raised outside of Philly, she lives with her husband and children in Brooklyn. Her debut novel, Lech, is out now from Tortoise Books. Please help us welcome Sara.
Thank you, Emily, for that very thorough introduction. Thank you, Robert, for inviting me to be here. This is such a treat. So I'm going to read from my debut novel. I'm going to just set it up for you guys a little bit, and then I'll read a section. Lech, can you hear me okay? Yeah. So Lech revolves around a potential sale of a property in the Catskills in the summer of 2014. But really, that's a really rather lame elevator pitch for a book that explores the predatory impulses of human nature. It is also a novel that asks the question found in Genesis of Lech Lecha, which is how to go forth, how to build a life, freeing yourself from, or at least learning how to navigate some of the things that we carry. It's told from 5 different points of view, and tonight we're going to hear from Paige. So to set up Paige's story, Paige Murphy is 22 years old. She is the daughter of Noreen, who is the local real estate agent up in Sullivan County, who's trying to finagle this property sale. When she was a child, she and her mom were taken in by a local farm family named Trawler, and Cole Trawler, who you'll hear about tonight, was Noreen's classmate and is Paige's longtime abuser. So yeah, there's just a content warning throughout this book. So anyway, Paige works at a diner by day, and at night she is a candy striper at a local hospital where she has access to prescription drugs, which she hustles as a side biz. She is desperate to get out of the town of Neversink, but it's just not that easy. One of the things that's holding her back is her exterminator boyfriend named Tommy. So here's Paige. You better be dead, Paige texts, but doesn't send. Tommy is late again. Tommy is on Tommy time. Paige is pissed, not needy. She checks her watch, looping the ambulance circle as if each lap might bring him closer. Her throat's an ash can, but if she goes back in for another cherry Coke, she might miss him. And then what? Tommy won't wait around. She lights one cigarette to the next, wishing she had a sweatshirt, wishing for a rocket to the moon, but she has only her hospital pinafore balled inside a limp string sack. She loosens the knot in her shirt that shows her belly. Tommy likes it. Sometimes Tommy puts his tongue there. She is a skinny girl's stomach, dough that won't rise, punctuated with an opalescent stud. Tommy is her ride. She's not about to call her mother. Her mom wants to be wanted, and Paige will not grant her the satisfaction. Noreen has told her never to count on a man. Men are good for one thing, if that. Noreen has urged Paige to make something for herself, but not too much. Get ahead, and people will cut off your feet. By people, Noreen means Noreen. She has conditions. Be smart. Finish school, provided school's no farther than Scranton. You're all I've got, Pigeon. How would you feel? For starters, Paige wouldn't be dumb enough to have a kid at 19, but she's not sticking around. People in Neversink only like you when you're down. Take Tommy. He feels good when Paige is bad, as if that might offset his shortcomings. Next to Tommy, Paige is a goddamn prodigy. She wants to shake him like an 8-ball. Will you ever get it together? Reply hazy. Try again. Paige has learned to hide away parts of herself, clever parts, ambitious parts, any spunky, formidable part, so that no one can take away who she really is, what she might become. Soon as Tommy Potts shows his stupid face, she'll start. Her pockets are full, the night hungry. The emergency lane is empty. County isn't equipped to handle more than run-of-the-mill hunting wounds, rabies, opiate codes. Anything serious gets sent up to Binghamton. Tourist trauma is airlifted to NYU. It's the chronic care unit that has Paige coming back. Twice a week, she moonlights at Sullivan County Community Hospital, SCCH, pronounced suck. What began as 120 hours of court-ordered community service for defacement of school property has become the most stable part of her life, the one thing that she anticipates after work. Maybe she never had living grandparents, but Mrs. Schroeder and Mr. Riley make decent understudies, as does Bailey Smith, whose diabetes has turned necrotic. Their eyes light up at the sight of her stripes. She reads to them. To Kill a Mockingbird, Great Expectations, The Good Earth. Less than minimum wage, but Paige would fluff pillows and dump bedpans for free. It's an awful thing to be sick, to be old and dying, trapped in a body that's betrayed you. Once she made the mistake of trying to explain this to Tommy, but he was in a bad way at the time, having spent a jittery, uncoordinated afternoon removing a family of possums from Mrs. Cunningham's crawl space. So she gave up, fished in her bag to give him something, then rocked him to her chest until he stilled. If she can restore some shred of dignity to Lance O'Brien, who'd been transferred to hospice in a diaper the size of a pontoon, then it's worth it. She doesn't fear death. Once she gets to Tampa, she'll do more end-of-life care, perhaps go to nursing school when she's not at the Mermaid Lagoon. She's read all about it. Tank mermaids are a dying art. But there's no shortage of people in Florida, no shortage of housing either, the surplus keeping down the cost of rents. In Florida, she'll work and swim and dream. The shitty thing is, life can eat away at you, even when you're young and healthy. Cole Trawler stole her childhood because he could. He was the father/brother/uncle she never had. Didn't she love him back? Didn't she want to sit on his lap? Her mom did not notice. Her mom chose not to notice. Cole bought Paige a Beanie Baby stitched to a heart that said, "You're mine." She lit it on fire. The plaything was replaceable. You could buy them at the pharmacy. Soon Paige had a shit ton of Beanie Babies, from calico cats to purple pigs. Each one Cole offered up like a lock of his hair. She took them like they were her purpose. You don't look a gift horse in the mouth. What you do is stuff the synthetic plush against your jaw, wet fur on tongue, teeth grinding plastic pellets until it's over. At 7:25, Tommy pulls up. His face is wrecked, but the suck of his cheekbones and the ice of his eyes are sexy. He gets first dibs. Amazing what she can take when no one is looking. Keys to the narcotics box right off the charge nurse. Like other hospital systems, SUC is dedicated to pain management. Patients are asked to scale their discomfort. Staff can't let them creep above a 3. Paige reaps the benefits. The Vicodin, which Tommy crushes with his fist, snorts off Paige's hand. They park near the river and push back their seats. Paige runs her fingers along the mats of his sideburns. After, he stows a bag in the glove and they slide down the slope to the boulders that forge a cliff. The light is falling. Golden cords off the Delaware, the river narrow but deep, good for jumping. They're not here to jump or fish. They're here for real drugs. Tommy says it like that, real, as if everything else is bogus. People live in sleeping bags on the rocks, still warm from the afternoon, smooth as the years that have shaped them. Tommy knocks them with his boots until they stir, their faces turned like thistle, bending toward remnants of the sun. It's Richie and Laura, Janelle, Tommy's tweaked out cousin, Silko. What do you want? Richie asks. Tommy gives the nod and Paige crouches, her skin popping out of her jeans like a biscuit can. Janelle, her eyelashes now burnt to ant-like bits, had been in Paige's homeroom. The air feels so silky, Laura says. Hunched in their bags, noses punched red, they look like lamprey eels. They're so far gone, what could they possibly feel? Tommy takes her stash and barters. Paige has warned him street stuff is garbage, but he doesn't care. Purity is relative. No matter how many times she's seen it, she dreads this part. Paige has rules. She'll snort anything once. No needles. Tonight, when Tommy takes out the tourniquet, she winces. Paige has watched too many YouTube videos. Her life has begun to resemble one long video. Every other minute there's another. Love dogs, volunteered at the Humane Society. Willard Pike was a big-hearted older brother. In winter, they occupy the deserted hotels until they are busted, then return to this spot along the river. Addicts are like whack-a-mole, like roadkill on Route 191, stricken and convulsing. She never goes anywhere without Narcan. Do you mind? Tommy asks. His arms are a blundered mess, and she's a practiced phlebotomist. She can perk up the weakest vein. Her stomach flips as she releases the dope into his bloodstream, filling him up, and watches for his look of drift. In her lap, he's at peace, and she gets it. She has brought him here to this distant place where there is no anger, only calm. The river glints in the summer light. These are the stolen hours, the sun bursting in a wild bouquet of color, purple, orange, electric pink. She coils the belt and eases out from behind him, making sure before she's gone, he's propped up, good and steady. Thanks.
The language of this. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump in. I have like a bunch of questions.
Sure.
So I read Lech and your other Doll Palace and Jerks
Do we-
and,
I'm sorry.
oh, when you fleetest. And it's your turn. Is it quick turn, right? That's what we need. Okay, we need, does this work? Okay. Well, yeah, and I wanted, so I saw a lot of like recurring, I feel like this doesn't work, recurring themes throughout that I was interested in, which was, I guess, motherhood, girlhood, a lot of womanhood, Judaism, especially in Lech, domesticity and like sort of desire and those things being at odds with each other at times. And I was just curious, are those sort of themes that have always kind of pervaded your work, or, you know, have they shifted over the years? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know if is this, yeah, it's coming in. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I say this to my students, I say this to everybody, like all we can do is own our shit. Right. And so there are things that that each of us probably, you know, obsesses about and that keeps us up at night and that we think about and that we return to. And, you know, for better and for worse, like this is our material. Right. So, yes, you're absolutely right. These are recurring themes. I hope that I'm not necessarily beating a dead horse, that like I'm coming at them from, you know, somewhat different angles, but I think that, you know, all we can do is respond to what's calling to us. And so, yeah, the ambivalence of motherhood, certainly, the idea of, you know, what society, the expectations that society establishes for various people and the way that we both hew to and reject those constraints. That's something that's infinitely interesting to me, that sort of disconnect between how we are publicly versus how we are privately. Like all of that has continued to interest me, and I keep puzzling through and I still don't have any answers. So, but yes, you're absolutely astute to pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you don't have to have the answers, right? That's why you keep, you know, if you had the answers, you wouldn't want to keep writing about it probably. Do you feel like you like approach, well, I'll ask a different question. When you wrote your short story collections prior to the novel, did you always intend to write a novel, or like did one of your stories sort of turn into a novel, or like how did you come about that shifting of short stories to a novel?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. You guys don't need the mic. Do you need the mic?
Well, they need that.
Okay. I love this question. So I consider myself primarily a short story writer. And we can talk about that and various struggles with that. And as a matter of fact, this novel project took such a long time. And I will say two things about it. First of all, what's interesting, you know, one thing to think about as all of you are writing your stories or your, you know, whatever genre you're writing in, the notion that the narrative is kind of telling you what container it wants, you know? So I think most of the time I'm dwelling in the short story form, but for whatever reason, the seedling of this idea was speaking to me in a larger canvas. And even though I only had initially sort of a very small seedling of an idea, it felt expansive to me in a way that as a story writer terrified me. And so, which is partly why it took me such a long time to write it. But in the interim, just because, you know, the notion of sustaining a narrative over a period of time was outside of my comfort zone and what have you, in that process, once I arrived at sort of the murky middle of the novel, which I'm sure many of you can identify with being sort of in the murky middle of whatever project it is that you're working on, I discovered that the way for me to find more energy was to cheat on the novel with short stories. So like this novel deals a lot with transgression. My short stories deal a lot with transgression, and I would transgress by writing short stories. So what happened was I actually had my short story collection Jerks is kind of like the wart on top of the novel that kind of grew out of it. So that I wound up having the collection even before this book was finished. And that was kind of a way for me to kind of reconnect with that energy, because there's something for me, again, naturally, that's sort of my narrative impulse is to go short story. I feel a greater sort of sense of energy with the story. And so that was wound up being sort of a useful, at the time, I thought I was just dicking around and procrastinating and getting farther away from the project, but it actually helped me to cross the finish line of the novel by writing all the short stories in the interim.
Yeah. That was gonna be another question.
Okay.
Because I'm always curious about like writers who write in multiple forms or genres or whatever, what have you. If you like work on one thing at a time, like, because I'm someone that works on many things at once, but sometimes I wonder if that's to my detriment. So it's interesting to hear how you thought, it was in service of it at the time, even though at the time you thought it was, maybe veering away. I also, because you just read from Lech, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about like your decision. It's really cool, and I think like ambitious in a lot of ways, and your decision to use with tense and present, third person present, and alternating characters throughout. And we follow 5 different characters, and like I'm just always curious how writers land on the decision of like point of view and tense and all of that.
Another good question. Yeah, so I mean, like I said, the initial seedling of the idea was really, it was, and this is again something we can think about, like, how do you know that an idea is an idea that you're going to actually chase down? But it just didn't go away. But all I really had at the time was sort of this like vague feeling of a sort of voyeuristic story in which an older man rents out his property and then doesn't leave. And that was really the only thing I had. And so, yeah, so it started in one point of view, and then I doubled. Then I had the renter, and that was the second point of view. And then I realized that actually I was telling a larger story, a story about a place, and a story about a place in time, a story that hopefully also serves to be somewhat of like a biopsy of our country in a particular moment as well. And so that then the perspectives grew. And so then I had 4, and then the 5th point of view came in very late at the end. But yeah, I mean, in terms of writing, again, this goes back to like leaning on, the way that our narrative strengths, we lean on them, and then they can also be hindrances, and so for me, because I do think in the story form, it was helpful to be switching point of view and to be moving, advancing each character story in these sort of shorter sections. The downside of that is that, perhaps the novel suffers from what, I've been heard is storyitis, where like some of the drama is sidelined. And so that was a process for me to actually learn how to sort of lean into the actual drama on the page. Story writers often we can get away with being somewhat elliptical.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Interesting. The idea of like, just the whole function of having it be like, I've never heard that, the elliptical idea, because I feel like very personally not strong in short stories. So I'm curious the difference in the approach. Well, originally it was only poetry. And then I sort of like tricked myself into trying to write a novel like a couple of years ago. So I'm also working on a novel, but then I still, I guess, cheat on the novel with poetry. Yeah. And exactly. Yeah, which nourishes it, right? Yeah, and it feels most natural to me, where the novel feels like something I'm just trying to like teach myself in a way that I never felt with poetry. I mean, that's its like own thing, but that's probably a similar feeling with like the short stories for you, and then approaching the novel. Right. And fighting against that complacency though too. It's like if you can settle into that comfort zone and be, and feel sort of safe in your form that feels natural to you. And then at the same time, that's also a strong indicator to kind of push against that container, and to kind of, in order to grow as writers, right? We have to face, what's scary. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's also why I personally am just constantly thinking about like tense and point of view and things like that, because as a poet, those were never serious questions on my mind. I also wanted to ask a little bit about, well, actually, quickly, so this takes place in the Catskills in 2014, right? And what's your connection? So it's like sort of like the Borscht the Borscht Belt. What is your connection to the place, since place is so important?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time. I never really grew up going to the Catskills, so it was sort of abstract. I grew up in Philadelphia. We went to the Poconos if we went anywhere at all. And so, the Catskills I understood as a place of lore, as sort of this hotbed of Jewish comedy in a certain time period that had, fallen into sort of disarray. It's sort of, this sort of has been quality akin to like, Atlantic City also, right? Of having been, and so that to me in itself is sort of this built-in metaphor, like, and when you can find a metaphor in the place, then you've got something. But but it was really fairly abstract to my own personal experience. However, I spent a lot of time as a child and also as an adult on the other side of the river in, not to get too technical, but in Wayne County, Pennsylvania, in the Poconos, was where I went. I attended summer camps, and then I returned as an adult, as a mother, to that same summer camp to teach. And so around that time when I was returning and spending my summers as a creative writing teacher at this camp, was around the same time that I had that seedling of an idea, which initially I thought maybe it was in the Hamptons. Like, I didn't know where, what like, that voyeur is, like, I didn't know, I didn't have a place for it necessarily. I didn't have the anchor. But I tend to write from place. And so when I was, one of the summers when I was up at this camp as an adult teaching, there were so many, the tensions were so high between tourists and locals and so forth. And I just felt like this was what was calling me and I had to go there. And so what I wound up doing was a ton of research. Like, on my days off, I would go drive to Sullivan County and go in, so and then I read, tons of books and what have you. And and so it became clear to me that it had to be in the place of the former Borscht Belt, and the notion of Catskills decay was just too irresistible for me to pass up as location, but then also as character, because hopefully the place takes on some of that presence in the book.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I was actually on like my own, like, my grandparents met when the Borscht Belt was still the Borscht Belt, and I was up there this summer. A little bit different story, and so I was on like a Google hole recently on like the whole decay of the Borscht Belt. So I was very pleasantly delighted that this took place there.
I will say that when I was 16, as a camper, they like took a bunch of us. I went to the Jewish camp, and when I was 16, they like rounded up a bunch of us. And I guess this must have been like 1990, and they like put us on a bus and they took us to one of these old resorts. That was like one of the few that was still around. I want to say it was like Brown's Resort or something. And they took us and they like dropped us off, and it was one of these resorts that was clearly like had it already, and like nobody there was under 75, and they made pulled our little string and then like had these like little Jewish kids to talk about Jewish camp to these older Catskills resort people, and at that moment. And so I think that probably subconsciously that memory somehow worked its way here, because it was such an uncomfortable exercise in performativity, and there was something so deeply sad and disturbed about that whole event. I'd largely forgotten really until like now. But I think it's in the fabric for sure.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm not going to harp on. I could have a conversation on just the Borscht Belt, but I also speaking of like Jewishness in your writing, especially in the novel, it made me think a little bit of like Philip Roth and like Bellow and a lot of, I guess, like that era of like Jewish writers. And I guess that's like a question of just like your inspirations or who you feel like your work is in conversation with. Yeah.
Another great question. I'm like, yeah. So, I mean, yes. So I grew up, reading what I call, can I be profane on? Okay. What I call like the big dicks of, the Jewish canon. I grew up with them, I grew up with Roth, I grew up with Herzog, Bellow. I grew up with, like all of these guys. Right. And they were hugely influential to me. And at the same time, and this is something about influence and like the writers that are, when you ever get this question about like, who are the writers that influence you? These writers were hugely influential to me, but incredibly infuriating to me at the same time. And so it's like that friction when a writer, it doesn't have to be necessarily like a writer that's your, that you agree with or admire, you can admire their sentences, but they provide this sort of friction for you to push up against. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe it sounds really, lofty and presumptuous, but it's no accident that, the title of the book is One Name, Last Name, in the same way that, Bruce J. Friedman's Stern is One Name, Last Name, Bellows, Herzog, One Name, Last Name, and so forth. And so like, I really did want to take on some of the classic tropes that you see in what's considered to be sort of the old, Jewish American canon and sort of subvert them and filter them through a fiercely feminist lens. So like, that was definitely part of the impetus for going forth and part of the setting, which driving that. And so, like Mickey Sabbath, there's like notes of Mickey Sabbath from, those who've read Sabbath Theater, like it's all, there are a fair amount of like Easter eggs inside. So that was part of the driver for sure.
I feel like there's not, what's cool about it is because you come at it through this like feminine point of view, right? But you're dealing with like harking back to the like very dominant Jewish male canon, like you said, and there's not too many writers that I can think of that are female that engage with that. I mean, there are some that I can think of, but I feel like no.
Yeah, like all those themes. I mean, I don't want to get too in the weeds with all of this, but like some of those themes that you see in what's considered to be sort of the old Jewish canon, like isolation, alienation, and then there's like always this undercurrent of lust, as well, and like the lust is always sort of a male, lust, and so there was a lot of that, as considering the book explores predation, but I wanted to sort of reclaim some of that, so that it's and to give it fresh energy.
What are timing wise? I don't know.
We can move into a Q&A after you have one more question.
Yeah, I have more than one, but I'll find. Okay. Yeah, I guess I just was thinking you have like really very like sharp and like punchy like lines throughout that I was just like found myself underlining, especially with like dialogue, and like felt very authentic coming from people. And I was wondering, when you're writing, whether stories or the novel, like do you feel like you follow language more? Do you follow character, place? Like, is there anything that like you're really veering towards when you're writing, or none, all, whatever?
Yeah, I'm definitely a sucker for language. I would say that the way I arrived at writing was through language, and was through the sort of musicality of language, the rise and fall, those sort of lilts and cadences. Like when I was an undergrad, I mean, I went to a school, I studied creative writing as an undergrad, but like I went to the school that was very big on language. And so I went like, so far off the deep end with that, but language without any like you need to have something to say, right? So that dawned on me much later in life. So yes, I'm definitely like attuned to the ear of, the ear of the story for sure. But hopefully there is also a, imperative that goes with it, but it is language first, character first, for sure.
Do you feel like this is related, but it feels okay, I don't know if this is related, but feels related about like when you're writing like stories, before they become like a collection, do you have like that idea of like that connective tissue thread, like how they're going to be later compiled, or how you sort of follow them as like from like an individual story to a whole collection?
Yeah, so with my first book, Doll Palace, I was a young mom. I was super frazzled. I found my way to flash fiction after a long period of not writing. And so all of a sudden, one of my friends actually told me, like, I think you have a manuscript, but like it hadn't occurred to me at the time that I had a manuscript. So that was that story. With Jerks, the same thing. Like I was just kind of cheating on the novel with stories, that's, there's something gratifying too about, I have I have a journalism background. So this idea of like writing something and then sending it out and seeing it published, like also felt sort of gratifying. And then I could move on. Whereas, when you're working on a novel for so long, there's like, nobody throws you that bone, and I'm again, like, I want the bones. So, but yeah, I was just writing stories. And then, at some point I think I made a joke to someone and said, like, if I ever write if I ever do another collection, it'll be called Jerks, right? I had already published the story, Jerks, but then I realized that like, oh, okay, that word in itself has the sort of the fuel and fire, not only like on one, but also has sort of that, the, sort of masturbatory like undertone that I think also carries through that collection. So then like that became, it was more deliberate, and then just sort of picking and choosing what stories went into that collection. Mason Jar Press, the press that put out the book, likes really short books. So I actually wound up cutting a lot of the stories, leaving them on the, leaving them out in order to have sort of a tight little book for that.
Thank
you.
Thank you. I guess we'll go to Q&A.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hi.
I was wondering if, you talked about writing for stories and novel and writing a novel to write a story. I was just wondering, like, when you have like a lot of things on your computer, a lot of unfinished stuff, whatever you can write from, it's never make you kind of anxious, all these projects in your head, like back.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, so look, I mean, I think the way that we live in the world sort of fosters this sort of adult ADHD. Like I'm throwing the term around glibly, but like we are, we're reading multiple books at any given time. Our browsers have so many things that are open anytime. Like we're just consuming what can happen when we're consuming so much at any given time is that there's sort of this cursory level, right? That where it's hard to go deep on anything when we're like, floating between so many things, right? So I'm completely guilty of that as well. And I'm cognizant of that impulse. Like I flit, so it's a matter of sort of also harnessing it, so that when I wouldn't say that I'm working on like 5 different short stories and a novel, but like when I was feeling, like I said, this book took me an embarrassing long amount of time. And so and lots of despair, right? And lots, the mind fuck that we do to ourselves, right? When we're sort of stuck in the middle and we feel like we'll never get out of it. And, like those voices, those critical voices can get really, really loud. And so it was clear to me that I needed to just step away and take a break. That's when I would just go into a short story. And so it wasn't like I was going into like 5 different short stories. I would like, wrangle that one story or that one flash. I find flash fictions, compressed fictions, super gratifying because you can kind of get in and get out and say what you want to say and not, and also just the process of like whittling down what you want to say to its essentials. There's sort of, there's this sort of gross forgiveness in novels. Novels are, everything isn't perfect, obviously, but like there's sort of this baggage, right? But that idea of like working on something like super tight, can be so fulfilling. So I would do that, but I wouldn't necessarily be dabbling in like 5 different things, right? At that time period, at one time. But it's hard. It's really hard. And I feel like we're in a moment right now. And I was actually just listening to a podcast the other day, and it's like, we're in this moment right now where, close reading is what's so required for us, like as writers, as reader, to actually sink down in whatever the text is and to settle in. And yet we're in this moment where everything is just like super, super fast. And we're told to consume, there's a little, New York Times even now says like this, this article is going to take you 5 minutes to read, so it's running contrary to the whole process of close reading that I just think is so integral to all of us as students. And we're forever students, of the written word. So it's hard to like kind of retrain that focus. Yeah.
You talked about how like it was hard between the transition between writing short to long form because of like the fact that you're able to sort of abbreviate things maybe or push things off to the side of a short story. How did you ultimately get yourself to elaborate? Because I'm very much like some of us are taking a novel writing class, and I've been writing short fiction, and it is like my instinct is to like get out of the scene.
Right.
And so it's just wondering how you ultimately got over that hurdle.
I'm so sorry you also have storyitis. Huh? There is that impulse, right? That we sideline like the big dramatic action, like the big thing, right? It happens off screen, right? And we're like coming in at the aftermath, or we're coming, right? Again, I think, this is part of, it's just practice. It's like confronting that fear. It took a long time to, and even still, I will say, I tried through years to kind of lean into the dramatic action. That said, and this is, going back to conversation I just had with Robert earlier, that said, there's a drowning that takes place in this novel, like it's like 20 years prior to the book. So the book takes place like sort of in the aftermath of that. And, that was very intentional for me to have this like sort of cautionary tale as sort of the pulse, as sort of through line that kind of reverberates through the characters' lives. And yet, ask my agent, right? And like the agent would want that drowning to be pushed to the foreground, right? Which again, you ultimately have to just listen to your own sort of impulses and integrity, right? That said, there's certainly room for a greater drama for all of us, and to be, but also to sort of temper that and to know, to own your shit, own your voice, own where you are as a writer. Yeah.
I have a question about revision.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you have a particular process or practice that you lean towards when you're in revision, and does that differ from short to long form?
Yeah, so I'm one of those people. I'd say 90% of my writing is revision. So I generate super fast. Again, this is maybe like a process question, I guess, also, but like, so I, what I tend to do is like, I'll generate really fast. I also, because those self-conscious voices, those critical voices can be so loud, like I actually have to often do it longhand, so I'll just write longer, I'll write longhand, or I'll write long and messy. But I'm trying to capture sort of that imperative, like the essence of the thing that's getting me to the page in the first place. And then the rest is revision. And I actually, I'm like one of those people that I just find it so, like the idea of wrangling what you want to say and distilling it and getting it as sharp and precise as you'd like, is really fulfilling to me. It's obviously much more daunting on a larger canvas than, you know, in a flash piece or in a story. But yeah, I mean, I write a lot of flash, but my flash very rarely like starts out as short as it winds up. But it's in that compression and that like realizing that, you know, yeah, being forgiving, first of all, of the baggage, right, around it, and then to be able to kind of give yourself distance. So in revision, I mean, this book went through so much revision. I can talk about the various stages. If that's interesting to you, I don't know if that's interesting to anybody at all. Everybody in my family runs away when I try to tell them about my day. Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of, you know, I'm someone who needs, you know, again, I'm old and this is terrible for the environment, but I need to look at it on hard copy. You know, there are a lot of sort of visual tricks that I have to go through in order to kind of get that distance, because I feel like I mean, what does revision mean? Revision is just to see again, right? So how do we get our brains in order to see something that we've already been intimate with for so long, to see it fresh, right? And so whatever, you know, trick we can do in order to get to that place so that it feels alien enough that we can kind of get back in and be merciless on the line. In order to get what we, you know, an approximation. We'll never get exactly what we want, but get like an approximation of what we want.
Yeah. Hi. I also find myself tending towards flash a lot for a lot of the same reasons that you mentioned. It's you know, very gratifying. You can get something in and out finished really quickly. I guess I'm wondering how you manage to employ flash in the real world. You know, like how it seems hard to get flash published, just as someone that's coming into that world. So I guess if you have any tips or advice in that realm.
Yeah, I mean, well, two things. First of all, thank you for your question. There are, you know, two parts to that. First of all, I would argue actually that there's been a wonderful proliferation of online magazines that are devoted to flash, and I can enumerate a bunch of them, and we can talk after or whatever. But like there are like flash market, particularly online, is alive and well, and it's, you know, sort of a flourishing place. And that actually, for me, you know, I got my MFA like all of you, and then I moved to Texas, had some babies, blah blah. I took a lot of years off writing. And so flash was the way that I actually came back to the page and was able to connect with an actual literary community, you know, after many years away. So there is a really lively flash community, particularly online. Maybe there are fewer print markets, you know, like, but again, this goes back to, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, but like that your initial question about our attention span, like the idea, like, it makes sense that flash is proliferating because, you know, we're so fractured, you know, we can digest a 1,000-word story on our lunch break over a sandwich, right? And so I think that it's a great place to be. So first of all, great, amazing. And then the second part, is that I really, and I'm sure, you know, Robert's going to say the same thing. It's like what you're wielding in the miniature, like those editing skills, that level of precision and compression, if you can say it in 5 words and instead of 20, like that's only going to make for more kinetic prose on a longer, you know, on a bigger scale, right? So like everything that you're practicing I think it makes you a really strong editor, and also helps you to think sort of in the essentials. And I think that ultimately, that's really instructive to whatever writing that you're doing. As an aside, I'm just sharing this with you because you're all young. young and you're in a program, but I have a son in high school who's just gone through the college, the college essay writing process, and all these supplement essays like have to be 200 words or 300 words, and he'll come that, and he'll write some like baggy shit, and and I'll be like, you have to, whittle this down. And then at the end of it, he said, I've become such a better writer. Like having just the idea of having to cut stuff like really forces you to think, what am I trying to say? How am I what do I want to impart to the reader, and how do I want to do that? And so it forces that relationship. So I think it's going to be useful to you in whatever you do.
Yeah. One more question. Hi.
Hi. I didn't see you.
So I just wanted to ask, like, for practical terms, right? Like, how did you find your way back into sustaining a writing life?
Yeah. Well, I would say day jobs are important. When I was your age and doing an MFA, I also went to a program in New York. But I went to a program that was a night school so that I could, work, the whole time that I was in my program. But yeah, I mean, it's it's tough out there, for sure. And, I'm not going to gloss over that. It's been tough for me for sure. And so what do I do? I cobble together a whole bunch of like random gigs, freelance stuff, teaching, what have you, editing projects. I do a lot of manuscript editing and so forth. But no, I mean, the notion that one can make a living as a writer, is a really dangerous falsehood that's propagated. And I think that obviously, like, if you are that like 0.01%, that's for like amazing, good for you, like power to you, like amazing, but for most of us, I mean, very few writers, even writers that are like, what you would consider A-list writers, top, they're not necessarily making a living off of their writing. And so I think that, I think it's a dangerous mythology. And I think that like, if you love it, you're going to do it. And I had a writer, the writer Meg Wolitzer, maybe some of you know Meg Wolitzer's wonderful writer, novelist. I took a class with her at the 92nd Street Y, right when I was sort of, again, like young mom, had taken a bunch of years off from fiction writing, sort of trying to claw my way back, and, had screaming babies at home and what have you. And she was basically like, you have to steal the time. Nobody is ever going to give you time. Like, that's just not, no one's going to ever say, okay, go do your little, writing project. Like, that's just not happening. The world does not work like that. If it is important to you, you will find time. So, I mean, for me, it's often, it was often like 4 a.m, or, what these tight little, which is partly why I found Flash, because, or like when a baby was napping, it's like, do I shower? Do I do the dishes? Or do I knock out 500 words, And so, but that too, that pressure from the outside world also dials a sort of natural urgency, right? So like, you better have something to say because you're stealing the time and you can get it out, So there's sort of that friction that can be useful. I mean, it's not cushy or sexy or romantic. It's not a fairy tale, but if the writing, if you feel that urgency to write, to tell the story, you will tell it. However you arrive there, you will.
That's a good motivator to end on. No, it is that, right? It's like, I always think it's like, I wish I didn't want to or felt compelled to write, but it would be, I think when you know that you're supposed to write, it's like harder not to do the thing. That makes sense. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much. Great.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Robert. This is a treat. Thank you.